Everyone. It is good to be together on this beautiful rainy evening at Cedar Lane. I am the Reverend Katie Romano Griffin, Assistant Minister here at Cedar Lane, and I invite you, if you have a smartphone with you, to please check in on Twitter or Facebook and just mention that you're here at Cedar Lane and the Reverend Dr. Debra W Haffner is with us speaking today.
So on Twitter, it's at Rev Debra. So are you hashtagging? Are you hashtagged Cedar
We don't
Lane?
have a hashtag, but we can hashtag Cedar Lane, yeah. We don't have a hashtag for this particular event.
But you have a Twitter handle.
Cedar Lane, yep. We're at Cedar Lane. Awesome. The sound needs to come up a little bit. Thank you. You need us both to be turned up? Ah, okay. How's that?
Whoa.
All right. Now we're in business. Can you hear Dr. Haffner?
Good evening. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to take a few moments to introduce the Reverend Dr. Haffner properly, because she has led an amazing career and is just getting started. The Reverend Dr. Haffner is a sexologist minister and is a Unitarian, thank you very much, a Unitarian Universalist minister right now at the UU Congregation of Reston. And in her amazing, prestigious career, has written, I think it was in 1981, you wrote a manual for Planned Parenthood, is that right? And in 1986, convened the first conference on adolescence and AIDS. The Reverend Dr. Haffner has written multiple books on raising children, and I just want to share a few of these books with you. There's a book of Meditations and Good News, A Time to Heal, which is about protecting children and ministering to sex offenders. What every 21st century parent needs to know, facing today's challenges with wisdom and heart as the parent of 2 teenagers. I can tell you this book comes in handy. From Diapers to Dating is another one of the Reverend Dr. Haffner's book, and A Time to Build, which every minister in our denomination must read this book as part of our certification process. We literally must read this book because the Reverend Dr. Haffner, in her role as the co-founder of the Religious Institute, created a program that is the gold standard for preventing clergy sexual misconduct, not just in our denomination, but across denominations. It's a trans-denominational program. So please give a hearty and warm welcome to the Reverend Dr. Debra W Haffner. Thank you.
So it's really lovely to be actually back here in Cedar Lane. I think I've spoken here maybe 6 times since the early 80s, and I want to do actually a shout out to you all. The first time I was coming to Cedar Lane was when I was the director of Education, Counseling, and Community Affairs for Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington. And the women from Cedar Lane were the backbones of Planned Parenthood of Montgomery County. And I was saying to my husband who's here on the way over, I don't remember their last names, but there was this wonderful woman named Yuki, who was a very strong leader from this church. Our director of our clinic in Montgomery County was named Flo. I also don't remember her last name, but she was also a member of this church. So I go back a long ways with Cedar Lane.
Awesome.
So it's nice to be back here.
It's good to have you back. I also want to shout out to the Reverend Archine Turner, who is in the back, and you're going to hear a little bit from Reverend Archine in just a little bit later on in the program. Dr. Haffner and I are going to have a conversation tonight. I have some questions prepared, and you are each invited to have a note card to write your own questions on. Our intern minister, Norman Allen, and some of the ushers will be coming around throughout the program while we're having our conversation to collect your cards, and then we will read your questions to Dr. Haffner. Let us begin.
And you can call me Debra. How's that? Okay. Is that okay? And I can call you
Katie.
Reverend Katie, good.
Thank you. So you call yourself a sexologist minister. What does that mean?
So I noticed when Katie introduced me, usually when people would hear that, they kind of laugh. Those words are seen as oxymorons, kind of like jumbo shrimp, right? They're words, people hear sexology and ministry, and they don't seem to go together. My first career was in sexuality education, starting actually in the federal government back under under Joseph Califano. I ran a national adolescent health program in the late 1970s, and then left there to go to Planned Parenthood when Ronald Reagan came to office. And my boss at the time in the government told me it was time to leave because I was going to become a Xerox operator if I stayed during that transition. And so my first career was all about sexuality, and when I became the president of SIECUS, the Sex Information Education Council of the United States, our mission was to help people understand that sexuality was a natural and healthy part of life. What I used to say about that was that the head of the American Lung Association never had to start his speeches by telling people that breathing was a natural and healthy part of life. And so that there was something wrong with us as a culture, that this part of us, which is as much a part of who we are as our respiratory system, our circulatory system, somehow needed to be affirmed in this different way. After I felt a call to ministry, which was actually a fairly dramatic call to ministry, what I realized was that there was a need to bring my knowledge about sexology into religious movements. Not only the Unitarian Universalist Association, but we knew at the time that, for example, very few seminaries prepared their clergy to deal with sexuality issues, that there were great divisions going on in the 1980s and 1990s in even the most progressive denominations trying to deal with two issues. One of those is the whole issue of sexual abuse, and we're still really struggling with areas related to sexual abuse. But particularly, this was after the crisis in the Catholic Church that discovered clergy abusing young people. But what happened at that time was that, in fact, all of the denominations began to uncover these systematic abuses that were going on. And the second issue that was really roiling the churches in the 80s and 90s was this question of what to do about LGBT people. Although at the time, I think we just called it was just called homosexuality, and that where those denominations were going to land, and many of the more progressive Christian denominations, in fact, affirmed that lesbian and gay people, and there was the welcoming movement in the 1990s, and yet there are other very mainline denominations that still struggle. The United Methodist Church, for example, is very likely going to have a major split in the year 2019, because they are continuing to struggle so vociferously about whether, in fact, LGBT people can be welcomed and can serve as clergy. And so, as that was going on, and as I was discerning my call to ministry, it became clear that there was a role to play to help denominations, to help seminaries prepare people, to help congregations look at how they could be sexually healthy. And so that was my work for 15 years at an organization that I co-founded called the Religious Institute. When it turned 15, I decided it was time for my baby to go to college without me. And the board of directors hired a new director, and I knew that I wanted to, before I stopped working, I wanted to serve a parish. So that's how I ended up back in the DMV, as I understand we call it down here.
I've had to adjust to that DMV phrase. Yeah, because to me, I thought it was Department of Motor Vehicles.
Right, exactly.
So it's good to know that's new, because we didn't call it that when I lived in Northern Virginia before. Right. But we're glad to have you here.
Thanks.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Religious Institute and some of the work that is continuing to happen with the Religious Institute? Because it has an international reach to some extent, doesn't it?
Mostly domestic, but we were founded with the idea that it was important to create a progressive vision of sexuality for the nation's religious foundations. And it really has a two-part mission. One is the issue of how do we make churches and clergy sexually healthy? And the world basically, I mean, I was amazed when I went to seminary in the late 1990s that sexuality was not discussed. And I would sit in Hebrew Bible classes, and there'd be this story that would have this incredible sexual content in the Bible, and the professors would glide over them. And then I went into New Testament study, and there'd be these incredible messages, and they would glide over them. And then in my pastoral care classes, they prepared us on how to deal with people with depression and anxiety, and how to help people through grief, but nothing about how to help people with sexual concerns. And so I became increasingly aware that clergy needed this training, and that congregations needed to look at how to be sexually healthy. But the other piece of it was that when we were formed, if I asked people who are the leading voices on sexuality issues in the public square, they said things like Pat Buchanan, and Jerry Falwell, and Focus on the Family, and people the voice was that religions wanted to control sexuality, that all religions believed that sex only belonged in a heterosexual, cisgender, monogamous, lifelong marriage, that teenagers should be told don't. I mean, you know all those messages. And so I was very interested in how do we create a network of people, and the Religious Institute now has over 8,000 clergy around the country. UUs are actually about 400 of them, who are people who are willing to stand up and advocate in their communities for sexuality education, for LGBT rights, for reproductive justice, to be a voice that says, actually, as religious people, we believe people have the right to make responsible sexual choices. And so we created a variety of training workshops. We actually worked with seminaries on looking at how to be sexually healthy. And through our work with seminaries, there are now 32 seminaries in the country that meet the criteria of a sexually healthy seminary, including requiring their students to have some sexuality training. We work with denominations, and so we did a lot of work within the UUA. Surprisingly, had a long way to go. Our denomination has a relatively short history on sexual justice. For example, our first gay minister wasn't ordained until 1979, and that person had a tremendously difficult time finding a pulpit. That feels really odd today because we and the United Church of Christ, as well as the metropolitan community churches, are the churches people think of as really good on lesbian and gay issues. But we also know that as we now talk about LGBTQ, the Unitarian Universalist Association is much better on the L and the G than it is on the B's, who are almost never talked about. And we are learning about how to do trans issues, but it's only been in the last less than 5 years that we have been settling trans ministers. So we too have a long way to go.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the building blocks of a sexually healthy congregation?
Yeah. So this green book that Katie talked about was really looking at this idea of what would a sexually healthy congregation have in place. And so we identified 8 building blocks, and I'll see if I can do them. I always tend to forget as I'm naming them this way. But the first is that there be sexually healthy religious professionals. And that means that those are religious professionals who have had some training in sexuality issues, but as well as model sexual health. And yes, that means avoiding sexual misconduct, which unfortunately our denomination has a pretty terrible legacy of congregations where clergy have misused their power to engage in sexual behaviors with people they serve, but it also means modeling an openness and a willingness to talk about these issues. The second is that clergy person is able to offer pastoral care on sexuality issues. And when I talk about that, yes, it means working with couples on how to have better relationships, including better sexual relationships, but there are so many. We once cataloged 100 different sexual concerns people might bring to a clergy person, ranging from my marriage isn't working to I have questions about my own or my child or a parent's sexual identity, gender identity, to histories of abuse, to infertility, to issues of elderly parents in nursing homes. I mean, to past histories of sexually transmitted disease, to HIV/AIDS. I mean, I could go on and on. And most clergy don't have those skills on how to handle them. So how to do the first intervention in counseling. The third is to do worship related to these issues. Now, I don't mean like every week, but we want, for example, our clergy to have the skills. I mean, I feel very strongly that every Unitarian Universalist clergy person, for example, should have given a Me Too sermon by now. And I gave mine, and Gar Young is on our board of directors at UUCR. I gave mine October 29th. Because it was like 2 weeks into it, I was like, wow, I need to talk about this from the pulpit. I mean, this is a real issue coming up for people. But something on AIDS, being able to, during Pride Month, do a service on LGBTQ people, et cetera, so that there should be, once a year, there should at least be able to be a worship service and an acknowledgement of those issues. The next two have to do with education. So, and this is your shout out, Archine. So there's education for children and youth, and then there's also education for adults. And so we are really, because of Our Whole Lives program, we and the United Church of Christ have created this gold standard program for sexuality education. Interestingly, in a study that I did, 2/3 of our UU congregations only teach the middle school curriculum. Mm-hmm. So we have a belief in America that sexuality education is something you do for young people in the 8th grade, and it's a immunization for life. So what I give you in the 8th grade is supposed to help you in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. And those of us, we all know that that's not true, right? That what we learn in the 8th grade, may set a stage, but certainly isn't going to help you when you hit perimenopause and want to know what's going on in your body. Perimenopause is not part of the 8th grade curriculum. How to have a sexually satisfying relationship with someone you have been involved with for 20, 30, 40 years is not in the 8th grade curriculum. But it is in our adult curriculum. So we have Our Whole Lives is a lifespan curriculum, and so we really support the question of, and we're not there in Reston, but I hope we will be, that this program actually starts in K1. Do you all know that? Do you do elementary, Al?
Not yet.
Kinda? Okay, I don't know what kinda means, but
there are lessons from OWL incorporated into our first grade lessons, but it's not the OWL program. I'm just repeating what our director of Lifespan Religious Education is saying, since he doesn't have a mic.
So that's a great beginning. But the OWL K1 program is actually, it's this wonderful program. We were teaching it during my internship in Hastings, and I love this story, which was the OWL teachers came to me and they said, it's going to be noisy in the back of the sanctuary today, Reverend Debra. And I was like, no minister wants to hear it's going to be noisy. I was like, so why is it going to be noisy? And they said, well, we're going to be taking the kindergartners and first graders on a field trip in the OWL program. I was like, in a field trip? And they said, yes, we're taking them to the men's room and the ladies' room. And so the field trip was to see what a boys' room looks like and talk about why is there a urinal and why do boys pee standing up. And then they took them to the ladies' room and they showed them the Tampax machine and that there were stalls, and they used it as a way. Now, I just think that's fantastic. I didn't see a men's room till I was 19 years old. All right, I had no idea what a urinal looked like until I was almost an adult. And if you think about that, it's not so much seeing the urinal, it's the normalizing of, people are different. And now, of course, in today's world, we would show them the gender neutral signs and we'd talk about that. That would really make a difference in how you started to think about bodies. And anyway, and so we have a 4th, 5th program. Then we have the middle school program. Then we have a high school program. We have a young adult program, ages 18 through 35. We have an adult program, and we will, and they are just finishing pilot testing a program for seniors. In addition, there's also a program for parents. So what lifespan education looks like could be much greater than many of us do. The next building block has to do with how we handle LGBTQ issues. And so when was the last, you are all our welcoming congregation. When did that happen?
I know that the last recertification, I talked to our executive director, and she said it was about 10 years ago. And there isn't, we have a Together team, which is responsible for gender justice as one of their mandates, but we do not have an active welcoming congregation committee that I'm aware of at this point.
So, are you raising your hand? Okay.
So there was a revision. Right. That one was about 10 years ago, though, Sarah said? About 7? Okay.
So what's interesting is, and I can tell you as a sexologist, that our understanding of some of these issues actually is rapidly changing.
Yeah.
Our understanding of transgender issues, our understanding of how to, in fact, deal with gender variant children who don't easily fit into gender boxes, how we support young people who are teenagers who are thinking or considering or their own transitions. So there's a lot to be thinking about. Just even if you think about in the Sunday school, are we prepared for a gender variant child or an intersexual child who doesn't identify with one sex or another? And are our volunteers prepared? And, I can tell you in my church, I don't think we're prepared enough. And so how to have those conversations. Interestingly, when I looked at, in a study I did for the UUA in 2010, I discovered that the Welcoming Handbook was last updated in 1999. Mm-hmm. Now, just think about how the culture has changed, right, in the last 20 years on these issues. I mean, just dramatically. I mean, we couldn't have, 1999, the idea that same-sex marriage would be legal in the United States would have been a fantasy. We wouldn't have believed that was possible. And so having that ongoing discussion, but also looking at how do we recognize the fact that we are increasingly understanding that there is not a binary, and how does that affect how we do our work, and how are we truly welcoming to LGBT people. And I'm really proud of the fact that I am chairing a committee at our church who is leading our community in creating the very first Pride Festival that will ever take place in Reston, Virginia. This June 2nd, it's going to be a family-friendly, fabulous day, so we'll be hoping the other congregations will come out and support us. Okay, then the next one is safer congregations. Mm-hmm. So really looking at what is a comprehensive policy. And my experience with UU congregations around the country is people did safety work also about 20 years ago, and in the 1990s, and people say, we wrote that policy. And then I say, well, what does it say? And they're like, well, let me find it for you. Safety should be a living, breathing activity in our congregations so that we provide a place where people are safe from abuse, harassment, and misconduct. As well as, and that's one of my books, which is how would we handle somebody who is either accused or arrested of a sexual crime, someone who's coming out of jail, who wants to become part of our community, somebody who, there are a lot of people now, you read about in the paper all the time, who are arrested, for example, on using the internet, and they're caught in stings for pornography. if that happened here and one of your members was arrested, is there a policy for the community to know how to respond?
I think we have a limited access agreement, but our policy actually wouldn't speak to that particular issue.
So that whole area of updating our safety policies. And then the last area, which I know very well because I see you and Reverend Abby in lots of places, is being involved in sexual justice, is as a community. And I know you all have been there during some of these ridiculous fights that have happened in Montgomery County about whether you can teach about contraception or not, whether you can teach about homosexuality or not over the years, standing up for women's rights to family planning and abortion services, advocating on behalf of LGBTQ people. So that was a long answer, but those are the 8 building blocks. And what I encourage congregations to do, and in this book, are checklists. So to evaluate, where are you and what are ways that we can improve how we are offering our services?
I'm glad you mentioned the checklist. And I think anyone who's interested, we can sit down together. Both Abby and I have copies of the book. We're happy to show, and so does Tim Atkins, our Director of Lifespan Religious Education. We're happy to sit down with you and talk about the checklist and go through the checklist. It's really powerful and enlightening in terms of it being a process and really shining a light on where we are and noticing places where there's room to grow and become stronger.
And I think, we are so good at the Unitarian Universalist compared to other places that we kind of we often, and I'm not talking about you all, but as my experience working with congregations around the country is we don't often step back and think, what else can we do? And so that's what I really encourage congregations to look at. What else can we do? Because we want to be sexually healthy communities, right? And so what does that actually mean?
Well, and what I appreciate, too, is we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
A lot of this work has been done. It's posted. There are things posted.
At the Religious Institute, right.
On the Religious Institute website, right. I mean, the information is right there and easy to access.
And as we all know, in a Unitarian Universalist church, change does not come easily. And so, the committee to do these things. I mean, I've had, and I'm looking at Gar, but I've had to be patient in Reston to not come in and say, okay, here are the following 200 things that we need to change. So it is a process of how do we move towards greater health.
I know you had something to do with OWL. What do you think about the UU Lifespan Education Program?
So I'm just a huge fan of OWL. Do you all know about OWL? Yeah. Do I have some OWL teachers here? Yes. Okay. So OWL was based on in the late 1980s, so a long time ago, and the early 1990s, SECUS, under my direction, created something called the Guidelines for Comprehensive Sexuality Education. And we looked at what should young people teach what should we teach young people? What are the key concepts young people need to know kindergarten through 12th grade? And so we developed these guidelines with input from the American Medical Association, the American Pediatric Association, the Centers for Disease Control, the National Education Association, and so on. There were about 15 organizations involved and published these guidelines. And OWL was actually based on these guidelines. And so that OWL fulfills everything we think young people need to know over that course of kindergarten through high school. And my dear friend Pam Wilson who is the author of Middle School OWL. Archine, I'm talking to you. Lives in Oxon Hill, and I bet she would be really happy to come and talk to your community of parents. Pam came out to Reston, and it was great to hear from the person who actually not only created the first program in the 1990s, but did the update.
Awesome. Thank you. I see you writing that down, Tim. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your books that you've authored about raising sexually healthy children. You've got some great information in here.
Yeah. So way back, almost 20 years ago, I was sitting next to a woman at a something called Renaissance Weekend, and we were doing the kind of like, what do you do? What do I do? And I said, what do you do? And she said, I'm a publisher. And she said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm the president of the Sex Information Education Council of the U.S. And I said, what kind of books do you write? Do you publish? And she said, well, we publish books for parents. So I said to her, do you have one on sexuality? And she said no. And so I wrote this book, From Diapers to Dating, which is every parent's guide to raising a sexually healthy child, 0 to 12. And then what followed that was a book called Beyond the Big Talk, Every Parent's Guide to Raising a Sexually Healthy Teenager. And then I actually then wrote another book, which as I went around the country giving talks on that book, I realized that not only did parents have a hard time doing sexuality work with talking about sexuality with their kids, because so few of us had parents who talked with us, but that parents actually had a lot of problems with parenting in general. So I decided to look at that. But so I've written 7 books. Only one of them has made any money. When I first met this woman, we had lunch. So after this meeting, she said, let's have lunch. And I said, so, like, what do you pay your authors? And she put a number on the table, and it was a really small number. And I said, how do your authors eat? Because, they're people, they're writers. I had a job, but these were people who, like, that's what they do. And she said, it's a great quote, she said, my authors don't eat. They don't use this money to eat. They use it to remodel their kitchens and send their children to college. So, indeed, one from Diapers actually has now been out since it was first published in 1999. So it has been on the market 18 years. It continues to be bought, and it's for this nice woman over here bought one of them and brought it for me. I signed it for her. It's out of date. And the thing in publishing is that the last version update was 2009, and so I've asked to update it. And what they say to me is, well, you're selling less books every year. And I'm like, yeah, because every year it gets more out of date. So I'm hoping to either convince them to do a 20th anniversary edition or to buy it back and self-publish it, because I'm so convinced parents need this very practical information. How do you teach your child about their body? How do we talk about where babies come from, and how do you answer that, and when do you do that? How do we teach children that their bodies are theirs and nobody is to touch them without their permission? How do we raise boys who are able to respect the gender of girls? How do we say how many of you saw today's New York Times Magazine article about porn? A few of you did. So there's an article about kids today learning about sex for the first time through pornography. I had some problems with the article, but and some of their suggestions. They were suggesting that we do porn education in high school, and they specifically say in this article, we've made the decision not to include sex education in that, which is a very odd thing for me. I mean, it's like the sex abuse curriculums or the AIDS curriculums that also said, we're going to teach these issues, but we're not going to talk about healthy sexuality. We're not going to give young people skills for what do we want them to do, but we're just going to tell them what they're not to do. So that was that's a little bit of a concern. But what's fun about this book is it's been translated in 11 countries, and next month I'm going to China. They're doing a new Chinese adaptation, and I'll be on book tour in China for 2 weeks, which is very exciting and intimidating. I'm a little nervous about going to China. They tell you, do not say anything that the Chinese government may not like. The Chinese government doesn't like LGBT people officially, and so, but I'm committed to not going to jail while I'm in China, because I'm pretty sure the president would let me stay there. So it should be a very. I'll probably give a talk on this in Reston. You can all come to when I get back and tell you what I find out.
Thank you. Why do you think that, well, I think you've actually talked a little bit about why you think whole life education is important, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more. We've talked a lot about raising sexually healthy children. What about sexually healthy adults and seniors who, maybe had that awkward 4th or 5th grade, girls in one room, boys in the other, here's the facts of life, that's all you need to know, now go forth, and let's never talk about this again kind of speech. So how do we serve adults and seniors now?
So I think we need ongoing education. I mean, I really believe that we need to be doing the kind of conversations and our whole lives and support groups. The largest group of people getting HIV infection in the U.S., the first group are teenage boys young men between 15 and 24, who think that AIDS is something that is not such a big deal. Which is, we have a son in this age group, and it's a little horrifying to sometimes have this kind of you just take medicine and you're fine. So there's very little memory of how the HIV epidemic decimated the gay male community among some of these young men. But the second biggest group are heterosexual adults over the age of 50. And in Florida, for example, there's very high HIV transmission rates among seniors. And part of it is that men who came of age sexually in the 60s and 70s and 80s, unlike men who came of age sexually in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where condom use was taught. It was part of the military education. Men knew how to use condoms. They used condoms. Once the birth control pill entered America, condom use went way down in the 60s. And those of you who are the baby boomers among us, I mean, condom use was like non-existent because we had the pill and other methods. And so there are men now who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s who never learned to use a condom. I mean, that was not part of their adolescence or their young adulthood. And so now finding themselves widowed or single, and I'm talking about straight men because certainly gay men in those age groups learned dramatically about condom use in the 80s when we found out how HIV was transmitted. But these are people who are now dating again. And there is no concept of that protection. And I shouldn't say no one, but very few people are doing safer sex education. But the bigger thing, and we're seeing this every time we open the newspaper now, is we don't know as a culture what it is to be a sexually healthy adult, right? I mean, if you think about these news reports almost every day of men who not just like inappropriately, but who misuse their power to and hurt women and men who they had contact with. That discussion, and I have been so fascinated as I've watched the Me Too conversation, and I've periodically wished that I was still the head of SECUS right now, because I have not seen since our National Teachable Moment in 1997. Do you remember our National Teachable Moment? The president and the intern, right? And so we learned a lot about sex as a country in those years. We are now in another, in my mind, national teachable moment. And very few people are talking about what does consent really look like? What does a healthy sexual relationship look like? How should we treat each other as grown men and women? And what should our expectations be? And do we have the skills? And what I think is happening now is that Me Too is emboldening women to speak out, which is incredibly, exciting and powerful to watch. I don't think it's changing men's behavior. I think that what's happened is that women are getting that we have the power to say no and to say, I'm thinking about those two women in the White House, in the last few weeks who have come forward with just such tragic stories of their marriages, and that they feel like they can come out and that something will happen. But we're not talking about what does great sex look like? Like, how could anybody want to have sex with somebody who doesn't want to have sex with them? right? Like that, like there's something really wrong with that concept, that good sex would be having sex with somebody who's not interested in you, right? So that's the conversation that I wish we were having nationally right now, and I'm not seeing it. And I don't think the Unitarian Church in Reston really wants me to be the national spokesperson on that. That's kind of a joke, but that's not my job right now. It's other people's work. But I think that conversation of what makes great sex and what should we all be aspiring to, right, rather than what we're seeing as a model. You know, I keep thinking, why do those men do this? You know, and they don't do it for sex. They do it for power, right? I mean, it isn't about sexual pleasure. It couldn't be about sexual pleasure because you wouldn't do it this way.
Well, I also think there's a lot of mixed messages in our media, what's on TV shows, and negative attitudes about sex that are reinforced with what we're seeing. But what about enthusiastic consent? How do we tell those stories? What do you think about that?
I think I think we need to be having the discussion about you want to have sex with somebody who really wants to have sex with you. That should sort of be like I think that's like a basement level of a good sexual reaction, and we need to be teaching that, you know, to pre-teenagers. We need to be teaching before they ever start dating. You know, we need to be teaching how do we get consent. And we talk about the media. In the media, what happens is two people look at each other across a room. They see each other. They instantly know they want each other. And then the next thing we know, right, they're kissing up against a door in the apartment. And then the next scene, they're getting out of bed, right? That we do not model how do you have a conversation. Right? How do you talk about what do you like and what do I like, and are we really both happy to be here, and how, you know, and how will we know? So I introduced a long time ago something called the CAHUMP criteria, and CAHUMP is CUHMP. And it stands for, these are the hallmarks of an ethical sexual relationship. And so the first C is for consent. The U is for unexploitive, which is really non-exploitive, but I needed a vowel. And so that people not using each other, but treating each other with the dignity and respect we say that everyone deserves. The H stands for honest. When I ask kids, what do I mean by honest? They often will say, well, if you have an STD, you should tell each other. Or one teenager once said, you should give your real name. And I was like, yeah, so that's kind of like, you know, your basement level honesty. But what I'm really talking about is, what does it mean that we're having this physical relationship with each other? You know, what is this about? And when kids, you've heard the term hooking up? So when kids hook up, which by the way is really no different than what we called making out in the 1970s, but when kids hook up, it's often with no expectation of any ongoing relationship, except that somebody often, as I say to young people, if it goes well, don't you kind of want to see the person again? And then kids are waiting for the text the next day that doesn't come because there's no discussion about, well, what if we want to see each other again? Or what if I want to see you again? So what is honesty? The M stands for mutually pleasurable, that in fact sexual contact between people should be good for both people or as many people who are involved. And then the last P stands for protected, that it needs to be protected against STDs and if it's heterosexual intercourse, pregnancy. And so I teach those criteria, and I've taught them to teenagers around America, but I've also taught them in nursing homes because they're not related to age. And they're not related to whether you're married or not. I mean, you all can think of probably of married people or coupled people or partnered people that you know where, in fact, the sex isn't honest, where it's not mutually pleasurable, right? Or maybe it's not even consensual, as we've seen in some of these cases. So marriage doesn't confer morality. It's the relationship that does. So I really think that these criteria are what we should all be trying to aspire to, whether we are 16 or 45 or 80.
Excellent. Do you think the UUA is doing enough to be a sexually healthy denomination?
No. But we're getting better. When I did my study, it was in 2010, and I did the study with the support of then President Bill Sinkford, who both he and John Burens were very supportive of this work and really put energy behind it. This was not a priority during the Morales administration. I don't think it's too early in Susan Gray's administration to know, but we certainly know this will fit. If it's going to be a priority, it needs to be fit into the intersectionality and a generic approach. We are doing better. We now require, which you may not know, we now require all of our ministers in training to, in fact, demonstrate sexual health competency. We were the first denomination to do that when I was on the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. There are now other denominations that require training in sexual health for their ministers. Many congregations do not have the kind of safety policies in place they think that need to be there. As we talked about, sort of the BTQ and onward has not been adequately addressed. So I think we would like to think we've nailed this, I think, as a denomination. And what I would say is that there is ongoing work that needs to be done.
Right, and I think, there's some amazing policies that are out there for safer congregations, and we have some good policies here, and there's always room to expand as we think about things in a different way. Coming from Florida, one of the first things I had said was, well, how do we vet folks who visit our elderly populations, because they're a vulnerable population, and sometimes the focus is on children,
right,
but we don't talk about other vulnerable populations. And when I think about being a sexually healthy congregation, it's, again, opening the lens and seeing it as full life sexuality education and creating policies that protect
So
people
at UUCR, all of our caring committee who does home visits is actually background checked. And they're background checked both for sexual issues, but also for financial issues because of the fact that elderly people can be preyed upon. So we want to do everything we can to protect people of all ages. And I do think this issue of I've worked, while I was at the Religious Institute, I would work with probably 50 to 75 congregations a year where someone in the congregation was arrested for a sexual offense, most likely an internet offense. And I really believe that every congregation will see this. Internet porn is pervasive. There is illegal material that people, I think, don't even really know is illegal material. Just FYI, if there's anyone, there are children in material, or if there are people who are acting as if they are children. So the people can actually be older than 18, but they have them dressed in little schoolgirl outfits, for example. That's illegal to use. And I think that there are people who, in fact, before the internet would not have found these things they wouldn't have known that they found them sexually interesting, but you go on the internet and you kind of can go down a rabbit hole and things that you might never have even thought about can show up, and people start using material, and then they get picked up in internet stings. So if this hasn't happened here, that's great, but you should know that it's happening in lots of our congregations. And so what would you do? How would you handle that? How would you respond? What if it hit the newspapers? How would you respond? So I'm happy to come and do some consulting with you all. Thanks. So should we turn it to that?
Yes, I think so. Do we have some questions? Norman, thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Is it possible for pro-choice and pro-life, as they'd want to be called, for people on both sides of the issue as they identify themselves as pro-choice and pro-life, to see each other as human and achieve some real dialogue?
Yeah. So what a great question. And I actually preached today about how do we love during this time where we're also outraged. How do we resist in the world and bring love? And I had a wonderful experience probably, David, help me here, 15 years ago? Probably in year 2000, right? Where the Aspen Institute, under David's leadership, brought together pro-choice and pro-life religious people for a weekend at the Y Island, which was some absolutely beautiful place in the Chesapeake. And we went around the circle to introduce ourselves, and there was a man there named Paul Schenke, and Paul Schenke had brought the case to the Supreme Court that said that people should be allowed to do anti-abortion counseling in the front of clinics, of clinics like Planned Parenthood. And the Supreme Court actually said that if there's enough space, they were allowed to do that. But so he's talking about why that was important and that was God's work for him. And I remember we got to me in the circle and I said, I'm really feeling like God must have a sense of humor, because if I'm called to this work and Reverend Schenke is called to this work, like, what does that mean? And so the day, and that was with a lot of trepidation in my heart when I actually said that. I can still remember the emotion of like, whoa, what are we doing in this room together? Mm-hmm. So that night, this reverend and I sat down and said, and I truthfully don't know if I said it or he said, but said, let's talk to each other. So I said to him, tell me why being anti-choice is so or anti-abortion is so important to you. Like, how did you get involved with this? And he told me a really devastating story about having someone bring him a box of fetal parts that had been left behind a clinic, and he had not ever thought about abortion, and feeling like that this was wrong, at which I think we can understand how that would feel really wrong. And I told him the story about my 16-year-old friend and then my 18-year-old friend when in the early 70s, abortion was illegal, and what happened to people, and why that had made me a pro-choice activist. And so we spent the night, we had like a 3-hour conversation and really listened to each other. The next morning, I saw him at breakfast, and he said, I have been on my knees praying all night. And he said, I just don't know what to do with you because I like you, and I'm not supposed to like you. We're supposed to hate each other. And he then said to me, I think we should write a book. Now, I had only met this man for 24 hours. I said to him, I think we should go on a first date first. Because writing a book, I have written a couple of books with other people, and it's like a very intense thing. So he and I went and we started to work on an article coming out of this convening on family planning. Because he understood that what he needed to support the fact that no woman should be faced with an unplanned pregnancy. And if no one needed to be faced by an unplanned pregnancy and have to consider abortion, how would we get there? And so he and I wrote an editorial together. And it was not easy. For both of us to get to a place where we could both sign this editorial took, I don't remember, but several months. It was a long process. We tried to get either the New York Times or the Washington Post to run it. They did not, and that was it was pre-blog era, so today we would have just put it up in social media the heck out of it to get it to go viral. But it was a wonderful experience to realize that, in fact, we do need to see the humanity. Yes. And what I preached about today, and I'm guessing you all have preached about this too, is how important in this world is that we not buy into the divisiveness. We not buy into hating people who think differently than we do. That it's really engaging it's engaging people, and I'm not talking about people who commit evil acts in the world, although they certainly need our compassion as well. But people who, like your neighbors, your family. I asked today at church, how many of you have a family member who you're barely talking to today because they support the Trump administration on stuff? And a lot of people raised their hands. And so how in fact, given the coarseness of the national dialogue coming, out of Pennsylvania Avenue, how do we stay in relationship, and how important that is. I mean, that really, that we cannot do justice without also doing love, right? So that was, you can listen to today's sermon on Wednesday at UUCR. My sermons are posted. But I think it's such, I mean, I don't have any easy answers. This isn't easy. Michael Servetus, you all know Michael Servetus is, right? So 500 years ago, Michael Servetus wrote, "It is easier to believe than it is to love." Right? Still true. It is easier to believe than it is to love. And so how we do that, I think, is a great part of our spiritual journey right now.
What are the top 5 things we should be doing in response to the Me Too movement?
So I'm wondering like who the we is, like we Unitarians, we the culture. Who wrote? Yes. Okay. So the first thing I think we need to do is we need to be talking about it, and we need to recognize that people need support for this. We did a healing ceremony in Reston that was quite amazing. Have you done something like this here?
We did.
Yeah. So it was just I had preached, and then I said, I'm going to light, because I have my own stories, I'm going to light the first candle and put the first salt in the water, and I had no idea. So I turned around, and there were 70 women lined up. And so providing a place for people to talk and have that conversation. I think talking, I would love to see conversations with both women who've experienced Me Too, but conversations with male-type people who can talk about what does it mean to them. I think that there are a lot of men walking around examining their own past, thinking about, did I ever do that? Could I be responsible? What would it mean to do restoration about this? I think certainly the education we do with children and adults is really important, and again, that goes into OWL at many ages, not just our middle schoolers. I think we need to be talking in our communities about what, I've kind of lost track of Montgomery County, so I don't know where you all are in terms of sex education in your schools, but how this conversation takes place outside of our walls, I think is important. And I think it's really helping examine our own practices, both our own lives, but also looking at, for example, I see this as a great teachable moment to open up the safety policies in our congregations and to say, how are we making sure this doesn't happen? And what's interesting in safety policy, something that many congregations don't address, and I have not read yours, but is, what do you do with the person who's on the make during coffee hour, right? What do you do about the person who hugs too closely during coffee hour? What do you do about, these things happen, they're real issues. And we both need to give people the skills, but we also need to stop it from happening. So I just did a training a few weeks ago at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York for a group of new rabbis. And this woman rabbi said, she has a guy who every week strokes her arm. He comes up in line, to greet her, and he strokes her arm. And she said, Debra, I don't want to embarrass him, and I don't want to make him feel uncomfortable, but this, it creeps me out that every week this guy is stroking my arm. And I said to her, you need to tell him to stop. You need to just learn. We need to be able to say, Joe, I love you. Please don't touch me. And she was like, how do you say that? And I said, so let's practice. Joe, please don't touch me. But we have to teach people to be able to have those conversations, right? And so I think it's an opportunity for us to be in conversation.
Something I've found since I've been here is the leadership is very committed to being sexually healthy, to shining the light in darker places. I mean, I felt like it's really a gift to work with the team that we have here. And I'm so glad that you're here and talking about ways that we can do still better.
And it's hard, right? Because Joe could be your leading donor. Right.
Yeah.
And so, or the chair of your whatever committee. And so we need to say, no, this is how we're going to treat each other. And yes, some of us have learned things that we need to unlearn.
So someone actually asked a question about the New York Times Magazine article, and the question is specifically, should the 8th grade OWL curriculum take this on more comprehensively?
So I think they do. And the new curriculum, so the update of the curriculum does include lessons on pornography. It's the hard thing about teaching about porn with kids to kids is that it's illegal for them to be looking at porn. So kids are not. So every porn site says there's a little. I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at every porn site, but I understand that porn sites have a thing on the front that say you have to be over 18 to go into this portal. But all you have to do is click on it. So how hard is that? Literacy around these issues I think is important. The average, how old the average kid is when they see porn in the U.S. now? It's 11. 11. Where are they seeing porn? So it used to be, right, that I'm looking at some of you who are in my age group. It used to be a big deal when the Sears Roebuck catalog came or National Geographic came to the house. That was like how you saw naked or half-dressed people. So now we give kids smartphones, right? And a smartphone that has internet in it. An 8-year-old who, when you were 8 years old, did you ever look up the word sex in a dictionary? Or, right? I wasn't the only one who went and looked up words or we had a world book. So we went and we looked in the world book. Well, now, if you type sex in the phone that your parents gave you and you're 9 years old, you don't get a definition, right? You get pictures or movies or, So one of my big things is do not give your child a telephone that has the internet in it. You will never know what your child is seeing. So under the age of 12, I don't believe kids should have phones, which makes me very conservative. But if you're going to give your kid a phone, you go buy one of those flip phone burners. You can still get a flip phone that has no internet connectivity. Because if you're giving your kid an internet phone at 7, 8, 9, I can guarantee they're looking up sex. And they're seeing. If you've never just typed sex in to see what just the first page of Google search results are, there are things that shock me, okay? And I've been doing this a long time. I mean, it's pretty, amazing, where some of this stuff goes pretty quickly. Yes, we need to be educating kids. What's very important, and this article didn't... And I want to read it again. Mary actually sent it to me earlier on in the week. It's with college students where we have more freedom. Everybody I know, all my colleagues who are college educators in sexuality, are teaching classes that are called Porn, Sex, Real Sex, where they're actually doing lesson plans. So this is what you're taught sex looks like in pornography. And this is what sex really looks like. And they explain how the movies are made over 3 days, that 120 minutes is, a 6-hour filming. And what do real bodies look like is just even that's important. So OWL does do this now. One lesson? One lesson.
Internet and the media?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. I want to repeat that. Maybe we'll repeat that. There is a lesson that's optional in the OWL program about pornography, but it's touched on, it sounds like, in internet and the media, but there's this other addendum that's a lesson that's possible that is optional.
And I think that probably the reason it's optional is people feel it's controversial. But if you put that 11-year-old average age of porn looking, so what's been fascinating in me, When OWL first came out in 1994, when we were developing it in 1994 and 1998, and they decided to get rid of, how many of you saw the AYS film strips? So you remember, some of you, right? So the AYS film strips were aging hippies making love, and it was really clear, the kids would just die laughing when they saw these particular pictures. And when the first slides came out, Pam, actually the author, and I had a lot of discussions, and both of us do kids really need to see that much lovemaking in the 8th grade and the pictures are pretty explicit, and people are making love in lots of different ways, lots of different kinds of bodies, different relationships, and I wasn't convinced that 8th graders needed that level of explicitness, but now, oh my gosh, what they are seeing, that they need to see actually what healthy sexual relationships look like, what people with not perfect bodies look like, that what are the, what is it that people do versus what is it what is the sort of normative range of what people do versus some of the fetishistic stuff. I said that wrong. Somebody help me.
Fetishized or?
Yes.
Fetish.
But I'm trying to put an IC on the end. Anyway, you all know what I'm talking about. Paraphilic pictures. So that becomes really important. We're now giving kids information that, frankly, all they've got is distorted pictures in their minds. So yay for us. I have to say, I once showed I was teaching at Union Seminary, and I used our 8th grade slides to do the anatomy and lovemaking with my seminary students. And one of the students in the class reported me to the administration for showing pornography in the classroom. And so I had to go in and talk to the dean, and they said, "What are you showing?" And I said, "I'm showing materials we show 8th graders." But we are so confused about sexuality, and so again, this is why why OWL is so great, is because it is honest information that's real for people.
Yeah, and I wonder too how we're educating our children about body positive versus sexualization. Mm-hmm. And I think about, I have nieces, and every once in a while I see a Facebook post and I'm like, Mija, what are you doing, my child? Let's have a conversation. But so what do you think? Is that wrapped into the OWL program? OWL teachers, how are we having these conversations?
Yeah, and the answer is yes, that sexualization is part of the issue of, a big issue, those of you who are parents, a big issue is clothing, right? Is how do you help your child give a positive image that doesn't sexualize them at 9 or 12? And part of my answer to that is to really have those discussions. What's the message you want to give with your clothing? And also what I tell parents is to remember that you're paying for the kids' clothes. So, you're not sending this child to the mall with I don't think your 11-year-old's not going to the mall with a credit card, right? That we do have the ability to influence. And I had a funny story in Westchester County where this question of clothing, and this woman raised her hand and wanted to know how do she help her child, she didn't like the way her child dressed and whatever. And I said, you get a Land's End catalog and an LL Bean catalog, and you can buy anything you want out of these catalogs. And, like any pairs of pants, any shirts out of these catalogs, this is what you're buying. And this mother said to me, "But Debra, I don't want to destroy her fashion sense." And I thought, well, then, right? You get that. And it's just always stood with me as, parents need to be encouraged that it's okay to be parents. I say to parents at my parenting talks, your kid could be mad at you. It's okay. I used to say to my children a lot, and they're adults now, but I would say to them, it's okay you don't like me so much right now, because right now I'm your mother, I'm not your friend. This is a big thing for the last 15 years, where women very proudly say to me, I'm my daughter's best friend, or my daughter's my best friend. Have you ever heard that? And what I say to people is, you know what, get an adult to be your best friend. That is not our role with our kids. And so part of it is, those 11-year-olds aren't dressing themselves. They're not paying for that clothes. So we need to assert ourselves as parents as well.
What are the best ways for congregations to support sexually healthy staff?
So I'm not sure I know what that means, but certainly it's to encourage people to go for training. And the Religious Institute offers a variety of different online training programs for religious professionals. But I think it's more than that. I mean, I am continuing, and I've been doing sexuality stuff for 40 years, which amazes me. But I go for training every year in this stuff. I mean, I'm gonna be taking a training in the end of April that I just found on sort of new counseling techniques and new issues in sexuality issues for adults. It is an ongoing process of education, and I think that should be built in to what our congregations look to us for.
Mm-hmm. And there's also, discussion in our denomination of requiring clergy to have ongoing, continuing education in sexual health and supporting
things.
that, right, as well as other things. So it's interesting to think about. We are fortunate here that we have support from leadership for staff trainings, and we're doing some of those actually in the coming weeks. So that's something that I've really been grateful for here. So this question is, how can we effectively educate or communicate with our kids about their bodies, their sexuality, without imposing a gender binary worldview? And I saw this happening when our child was in first grade RE, but didn't have an idea on how to counter it.
Yeah, so, I mean, I almost want you to answer this, Tim, but, certainly, so if, for whoever said that, I would really encourage you to talk with your RE program people if you have seen things. It's in our trainings, we make sure, for example, that we never say, line the boys up on one side and line the girls up on another. It's always, if you're wearing a red and blue shirt, go over, or red or blue shirt, go here, or if you're wearing a green or yellow shirt, go here. It's hard to resist, though, that binary. I mean, it's so ever present in our culture. And those of you who have kids, I mean, I'm still amazed that it's 2017, and if you walk into a toy store, there is still a boys section and a girls section, and that they came out with girl Legos. And did you all see this article like 2 weeks ago? There's going to be Lady Doritos.
Yes.
Like what the, right? Lady Doritos. I tweeted about that. I said, we don't need Lady Doritos. We need a lady president.
Amen.
Speaking up and really looking at, and doing that kind of review of our programs and our training for teachers. There was this book some of you may remember in the 70s called Free to Be You and Me.
Yes.
Do you remember this lovely Marlo Thomas book? So a lot of us are nodding. We still need to be doing that training to let people understand and explore who they are and what their potential is and what their diversity is. And in many ways, I don't know about your congregation, we have a number of gender variant kids in our congregation now. And I think we're learning from them. I am blessed the parents who have, the 4-year-old little boys who they allow to come to church wearing angel wings, and having the conversations, and how are we, and it's been interesting over time. For example, I've sometimes gotten calls, we have a gender variant or a queer young person in youth group whose parents are not ready to accept them, but we're ready. So we, our youth leader is calling that child by the name that the child gives us, and the parents aren't ready for us to do that, and that's kind of an interesting ministry issue, right? How do we support that family and that child? So, Tim, do you want to respond to that question at all?
I can run a mic to you, Tim. We do. I think we're at 6. Hello? Should be on.
There we go. I think it's on. We do have here, Reverend Debra, gender variant children in our program from elementary to high school as well. In response to the particulars of the first grade question, I know right now they're doing something on biological sex in the first grade class. So we are not getting as much into sex versus gender as we should be. And I am happy to work with any interested parents in how we can edit that curriculum to be better, because that's my personal goal for this class.
Great.
We're doing a version of Haunting House, which gets into birth and death, and so they're in the birth unit right now.
Great. So it's the beginning. Yeah, and it's, I think for those of us of a certain age, and I include myself in this, a lot of this is really stretching, right? I mean, those of us who grew up in a world that really, there was no alternative to the binary, and what we're seeing, in terms of my own education, we used to say that 1 in 30,000 people were transgender. That was, and by that we primarily meant people who would have fit into the bucket of people we then called transsexuals, which is a word that we don't use now, but people who believe they were in the wrong body. So what young people and young adults are really stretching us is that that's not 1 in 30,000, because we all have these people in our congregation. Everybody knows people who are in fact transgender now. So, I don't know what so we are learning is the point of this. And for those of us who grew up in a world where, the SICAS guidelines in 1991, the first lesson was boys will grow up to be men and girls will grow up to be women. And now the answer is most of the time boys will grow up to be men and girls will grow up to be women. And so that's a challenge to how to do that well. And there are people, there are sexuality experts, I'm thinking about people like Eli Green and Luke Mora, who are doing really important work that I can refer you to help us think through how do we do that better.
Thank you. I have 2 more questions for you.
Good, and then we'll let everybody go home.
Yeah. The first is, how do we teach our daughters to be safe without buying into the idea that boys will be boys?
Oh, that's the question. Okay. I was waiting for more. Yeah. So I think it's not just teaching our daughters. We have to also teach, all of our children. And we need to be able to, so it starts with teaching respect early on, right? It starts with teaching decision-making early on. So, when your child is 3, when we teach them, we don't hit. We use our words, or when we say, do you want to wear the blue shirt or the yellow shirt today? And so they learn that they can make decisions. All of that starts really early. It isn't something you wait until your child is, 15 to start talking to them about decision makings. The biggest thing, frankly, that we do is how do we model this in our own homes? So young people listen to what we say, but they actually learn from what we do. And part of this is going into being helping them do active media literacy. So one of my things is I really believe that no child should be going to the movies or watching television without a caring adult in their life with them. That in my books, I talk about a concept that I didn't create. It goes back, I don't know who created it. It goes back a long time, which is of being a teachable parent and looking for what I call teachable moments, everyday opportunities to give your children your values. And so once you move from Sesame Street, which I think have values probably pretty consistent with most UU parents, once you get out of Sesame Street, once you move to Dora the Explorer, there is gender messaging going on. Every sitcom on television has very strong messages about what it is to be men, women, in relationships, even what it is to be a gay person. is now on many of these sitcoms that now have gay characters. And we need to be the people who help them understand those issues. So both boys and girls need to learn that their bodies are theirs, their bodies are wonderful. Nobody should ever touch their bodies without permission. A big thing with kids is, I grew up in a house where my mother would say, you have to go kiss grandpa. Like, don't do that. Kids get to choose who they kiss. Kids get to choose who they hug. We want to teach them early that this is something that you do because you want to do it. You don't have to be touched in ways. And so all of that starts really early.
Thank you. And before we get to the last question, I want to shout out to Rev Archine, who I think has a message to share.
If somebody has a tissue, I would love a tissue.
I bet we have one behind the pulpit. There we go. There we go. There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad that you mentioned owl a lot. We are very blessed to actually be able to have this conversation in a religious setting with our children. But there are ways for us to take this education out to others, much like what we do with our social justice work. My friend Yakamina and I and Steve Colgan, who used to be a member here, designed something called Owl Out, where we took the OWL curriculum, especially the 7th to 9th grade, and we've actually incorporated some of the 10th, depending on the age of the children, to different communities around the DMV. We did 6 communities in Northern Virginia. We actually started out with our own Beacon House, which is a social justice. The first community minister in our association formed Beacon House. And so we started at Beacon House back in 2007, and we're getting ready to start it up again in different kinds of ways, including trying to get our smaller UU congregations in Maryland together, so we'll have the critical mass of children to teach OWL, especially in the 8th grade, and we're considering doing that in Northern Virginia for some of our smaller congregations like Akatik, and perhaps Reston, but you might do it your own way. And we're also going to be looking into the Latinx community. I actually have had conversations with CASA to see how we can maybe bring it to the children that they serve. So there's opportunities all around, but we need more adults to help facilitate these programs. And so in the back there, we have some sign-up sheets to find out who's trained and who might be interested in expanding OWL out in the community. And then there's, of course, within the community, like you said, very few of our Unitarian Universalist congregations actually do the lifespan OWL, and Tim and I have had a conversation, and we'd like to actually expand it here at Cedar Lane, especially to the young adult and adult communities. So please come by the back and sign up so we can, take this pearl out and use it in the way it should be used. I find this is actually the most life-saving ministry I have ever done.
And just as it's also really fun. I mean, if you've taught OWL, it's really fun being with these young people and having these conversations. I'm actually the alternate in Reston right now, and so I've gotten to teach a couple of classes this year, and it's fun being with these young people. So if you have any interest at all, find out more.
Right. And we actually have people who bring their children here for OWL.
Right.
And I think as we look at becoming a sexually healthy congregation and look at expanding to all ages, we really get to embody our mission and also invite adults who might come through our doors for deeper conversations. I mean, how do you have an enthusiastic and full consensual sex life when you've got 3 kids and you're both working 2 jobs and everybody's exhausted? Or what does it mean to have enthusiastic consensual sex when you're perimenopausal or you're in a different phase of life? So to be able to have those deeper conversations with the wider community can really change people's lives.
Right. On the tired adults with the kids who are the 3 kids in the house and it's always busy, the answer is sleepovers.
And your last question is, in your experience, what are the biggest challenges, cultural or otherwise, to congregational change around becoming a sexually healthy congregation?
That's a good question. I think that's a conversation that actually you all need to be having. My experience is that it takes, like anything here, like anything we do, it takes a committee of people who want to see change. It takes half a dozen people who say we want to do this, and probably the biggest barrier is that we think we're done. Like we have gay people who come here. We have a rainbow flag that's out. We offer OWL to the 8th graders. Like, why do we need to do anything else? And so I think having those discussions and having people realize we can do better. Yes, we are doing good things, and those are important things, but we aren't doing all the things that we could be doing, and helping. So one of the things that I did at the Religious Institute when we created the Sexually Safer program is we actually have a seal you can earn to put on your website that says Sexually Safer Best Practice Congregation once you have a policy that meets 90% of the recommended best practices. And you might look and see where you are on that. There's an assessment that's online you can take. And so we want people to be proud of this work. I think, how great that we're sitting in a church having this discussion. So we need to keep doing the work. We need to make sure we have the training, and we need to find out who's interested. And my guess is you have enough people here who would be interested and might want to work on this. So I will thank you all for your time and offer my blessings for the work that you are doing and the work that you are potentially going to do. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you for being here and having a conversation with us. This has been wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming here on a Sunday night to bring some of these important issues to light. So thank you so much.
And thank you.